It was not, strictly speaking, raining at the moment Lord Peter Wimsey alighted from the second-class compartment at Fenchurch Bishop. The clouds were merely rearranging themselves, with the sleepy vindictiveness of a dowager's tea party, and every so often one of them seemed to give a sigh and deposit a sulky drizzle on the world below. Wimsey, whose attitude to meteorology was as to most things, vaguely amused and mildly mistrustful, paused under the station canopy to adjust his gloves and quote, to no one in particular, "Tempora mutantur, et nos in illis," though the barometer, I dare say, remains resolutely English. A porter looked up from the burdening of a trunk and gave him a look reserved for harmless lunatics and MPs from lesser-known parties. Fenchurch Bishop had all the requisite accoutrements of a self-respecting English village. One post office, one vicar, 2 public houses, one decent, one clearly not, and a railway station that had somehow managed to smell of coal smoke and lavender furniture polish simultaneously since 1871. And now it also had, much to its own genteel dismay, a missing bride. Wimsey had not in fact been invited. He seldom was, until, of course, someone proved inconveniently dead, missing, or morally questionable. In this case, the disappearance of the young Mrs. Anne Carlyle, née Ferris, from her bridal suite on the very evening of her wedding had stirred up a deliciously and delicate fuss, one of those mysteries with just enough lace and lace-curtained windows to make the scandalous entirely acceptable. It had happened 3 days prior. The newlyweds had retired after the usual clinking of glasses and speeches. Lord Meredith's was said to have included a quotation from Milton and a faint hiccup, and Mr. Carlyle had gone downstairs to retrieve some mislaid letters from his valet. When he returned, the door was locked. He had knocked gently at first, then with increasing panic. There was no answer. Eventually, the lock had been forced. No bride, no note, no evidence of struggle, no scent of perfume lingering on the air save for the faintest suggestion of violets, though that may have been the parlour-maid's over-enthusiastic attempt at hospitality. She had quite simply vanished. Wimsey's invitation to the affair, the investigation, not the wedding, he was not so intimate with the Ferrises as all that, had come via Inspector Parker, with a note scrawled in an uncharacteristically cross hand. Either she walked through the door without unlocking it, or we are all to believe in fairies again. Come at once. Bring logic. Which was, in Lord Peter's view, the nicest thing Parker had ever said to him. The house in question, Dunbellow Court, sat on the edge of the village like an aged governess who suspected everyone of reading improper novels. It was built of greying stone, with ivy that had ideas above its station, and chimneys that leaned conspiratorially towards one another. From a distance, it looked almost charming. From close to, it looked like the sort of place where one might expect to find something nasty in the dumb waiter. The butler who admitted Wimsey did so with the attitude of one who had not yet recovered from the moral affront of the police drinking tea from the good porcelain. "His lordship is expected," he intoned in a voice carved from sweet and Anglican disapproval. "Then I shall endeavour to behave appallingly and live up to the billing," said Wimsey cheerfully, removing his hat and stepping inside. As he passed through the entryway, he paused. His eye drifted upward. There, just above the arch leading into the main hall, hung a peculiar portrait, a long-faced woman in severe black, holding what appeared to be an empty bird cage. Her gaze was fixed somewhere beyond the viewer, disapprovingly, of course. "Your local Medusa?" he asked the butler. "That would be Lady Hester Dunbellow, sir, the first mistress of the house. Founded the local temperance society and was known to strike out any verses she found indecent in her hymnals. Formidable. I dare say she's still at it, in some spiritual fashion. Might she have frightened off a bride?" The butler, to his credit, did not reply. At that moment, a soft shuffle of footsteps and a cough in the hallway signaled the arrival of Inspector Parker, who looked unusually tired, unusually irritated, and unusually damp. "Peter," he said, Don't start." "My dear Charles," replied Whimsy, "I never start, I merely interrupt." Inspector Parker led the way into a drawing-room that had tried very hard not to be gloomy and failed with considerable elegance. Whimsy trailed behind, noting the discreet shabbiness of a house still clinging to gentility. The silver a little dull, the carpet subtly worn at the threshold, and one candlestick on the mantelpiece slightly tilted, as if it too had developed opinions. "This is the first time I've ever investigated a vanishing act where the victim wasn't a magician or a stockbroker," Parker said, gesturing toward the armchair. "Do sit. Tea's on its way. I'd offer something stronger, but I'm afraid Lady Ferris has declared mourning incompatible with sherry." "Yet mourning presumes a death," said Whimsy, settling into the chair with a rustle of tweed. "And unless your methods have improved dramatically since we last shared a case, I gather no body has been found in the shrubbery." "No body," Parker confirmed. "No footprints, no note, no one seen leaving. We had constables crawling over the house for 2 days. Every maid, gardener, guest, and valet swears on whatever sacred object comes to hand that they neither saw nor heard a thing, not so much as a creak. A perfect silence. How suspiciously convenient." Whimsy crossed his legs, examining a porcelain spaniel on the side table as if it might yield a clue. "What, then, is the official theory? Sudden crisis of commitment? A honeymoon cold-foot shuffle? Or have we blamed the Romany folk again?" Parker gave him a look that suggested he'd rather like to throw the porcelain dog. "The official theory is that Anne Carlyle left of her own accord, but we can't figure out how. Or why. Left voluntarily, yet without clothing, luggage, or shoes." Whimsy tilted his head. "Even Eurydice had the sense to bring a drapery or two." "She left her bridal slippers under the dressing table," Parker said grimly. "Neatly placed, her wedding dress was hanging where she'd put it. No indication of a struggle, no broken latch, and the windows were latched from the inside. Could she have had a key to another room? Slipped out the back somehow?" Parker shook his head. "Only one key to that room, and Carlyle had it in his pocket. The door locks from the inside with a turnkey, and the windows, as I said, latched." Whimsy frowned slightly. "Do the hinges squeak?" Parker blinked. "I didn't check for squeaking." "Always check for squeaking. A locked door's only half as informative as a silent one. Still, no matter. Let's begin at the edges. Who was in the house that night beyond the newlyweds?" Parker reached into his jacket and produced a small black notebook, already creased and dog-eared. "Let's see. Lord and Lady Ferris. Anne's parents. Colonel Archibald Ferris, her uncle. A handful of family friends, Miss Eloise March, the bride's companion, the Carmichaels, one of those couples who always look like they've just walked out of an advertisement for tonic water, and of course, Reginald Carlyle's valet, named Jameson. House staff includes the housekeeper, Mrs. Blythe, a parlour-maid called Hetty, cook, undercook, a gardener, and one footman. A full cast, if not quite a dramatic one. And all alibied? To the point of tedium, they were playing charades until 10. The maid saw the bride enter the room alone at 10 past. Carlyle joined her 5 minutes later. Left again at 1/2 to retrieve the letters. Returned at 11:15. Door was locked. No answer. Knocked, waited, called, nothing. And at what hour did he raise the alarm? Just before 11. The footman fetched a spare key which proved useless. Lock was engaged from within. They had to force it. Room was empty. No signs of disturbance. Window locked. No balcony. Whimsy steepled his fingers. So we are dealing with a disappearing act in a locked room. That old chestnut. I must confess I had rather hoped for a poisoning or a decapitated clergyman, but this will do nicely. Who first noticed the oddity of the door? Hetty, the parlour-maid, said Parker, consulting the notes. She was helping Mrs. Blythe tidy up after the guests. Said she passed by the bridal suite and saw the light under the door around 11:15. Thought she heard someone inside humming, but no footsteps, no sound of movement. Humming, eh? Whimsy smiled faintly. A detail too vague to be useful, and therefore instantly suspicious. We shall speak to her. Also Mrs. Blythe. Housekeepers are notoriously observant and occasionally literate, and I'd like to see the room. The bedroom in question had the air of a space waiting for something to happen, perhaps a ghost, perhaps a governess. It was dimly lit by the overcast day beyond the windows, which were heavily curtained in a pattern of faded damask roses. The bed was neat, untouched. On the dressing table, a single hairpin lay askew, like a bookmark in a story that had ceased to make sense. Whimsy moved quietly, letting the silence settle around him. He opened the wardrobe and glanced inside. A row of gowns, all arranged by color and length. He checked beneath the bed, touched the windows, examined the latch with a flick of his thumbnail. He turned to Parker. Window painted shut once upon a time. See the old line of residue, but the paint's been scraped. Still, the latch is firm. Any signs of tampering? None. We dusted. Nothing on the sill. No ladder marks outside, no prints. The flower bed below is untouched. Whimsy moved to the door. He closed it and tried the handle from inside. No bolt, just the turnkey. And no other entrance? Parker shook his head. There's a connecting door to the dressing room, he added. But that too was locked, and the maid swears it always sticks. Then let us speak to the maid who swears. They found Hetty in the servants' hall, hands clasped tightly over her apron, and an expression of such wide-eyed rectitude that Whimsy felt momentarily inspired to confess to sins he hadn't committed. "Miss Hetty," he began, with his most winning smile, "I am Lord Peter Whimsy. I'm told you have an honest tongue and a good memory, two qualities sorely lacking in certain cabinets these days. May I ask a few questions?" "Yes, my lord." She bobbed a curtsy, though her eyes remained wary. "You passed the bridal suite on the night in question?" "Yes, sir, just before 11. Mrs. Blythe had sent me up to collect a misplaced tray. I didn't knock or nothing, I just passed by." "And you heard humming?" "I thought I did, sir. Just a bit. Like someone humming to themselves while doing their hair." "Can you describe it?" She looked embarrassed. "Sort of lilting, sir. Like a lullaby, but not one I knew." "And the door, did you notice anything unusual about it?" "No, sir. Looked shut as normal. But the dressing-room door sticks something awful. It always has." "Always?" "Well, mostly. I mean, sometimes it sticks, sometimes not." Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "It both always sticks and sometimes doesn't?" "Well," Hetty fidgeted. "Sometimes it don't, sir, if you pull it a certain way. Mrs. Carlyle said as much. She said you had to lift the knob while turning." "Did she now?" Whimsy leaned back. "And did she demonstrate this technique?" "She did, sir. Showed me the day after she arrived. Said she didn't like getting stuck when she was in a hurry." "Very practical," murmured Whimsy. He turned to Parker. "We must examine that door. Now." Back upstairs, they tested it. True to Hetty's word, the connecting door between bedroom and dressing room resisted at first, but with a certain angled lift and twist, the knob yielded and the door creaked open onto a small adjoining chamber, cluttered with mirrors and powder boxes. Whimsy stepped through, surveyed the room, then crossed to the second door, this one opening onto the corridor. It was unlocked. "Charles," he said. "Our bride did not vanish. She walked." Parker frowned. "But where to?" Whimsy glanced back at the heavy damask curtains, now stirring faintly in the draught. "Not far, I imagine. But far enough. Let's speak next to Lady Ferris, shall we? Mothers of vanished brides often have the most selective memories." Whimsy smiled faintly, and the portrait of Lady Hester above the stairway seemed to glower in silent complicity. Lady Ferris received them in what she referred to as her morning room, though the weather seemed not to have received the memo and continued to sulk outside the windows with gusty resentment. She was a woman of precisely the sort whom society had, for generations, depended upon to pour tea and bury family scandals beneath an avalanche of starched civility. Dressed in understated dove grey and clutching a lace-edged handkerchief like a flag of ambiguous allegiance, she gave Lord Peter Wimsey a look of restrained disapproval that might have wilted a less persistent man. "I do hope," she began, as he bowed over her gloved hand, "that you are not here to compound an already unbearable situation with speculation." "Speculation, Lady Ferris," said Wimsey, settling into a brocade chair with the sort of ease that suggested he might soon inherit it. "Heavens, no. I abhor speculation. I prefer deduction, less messy." Lady Ferris did not dignify that with a response. Parker, ever practical, cleared his throat. "We'd like to go over a few details with you, madam, about the wedding day, your daughter's mood, her behavior, any little thing you might recall." My daughter was perfectly composed. Her voice was like cooled porcelain, if anything, too composed. Anne has always been self-contained. It's not in her nature to make a scene. "Even on her wedding day?" asked Wimsey lightly. "Surely brides are allowed a degree of flutter?" "I do not countenance fluttering, Lord Peter. We are not butterflies." "But sometimes butterflies do disappear," he murmured. And then, more brightly, "Did she say anything, however trivial, that struck you as unusual?" Lady Ferris hesitated, eyes flickering toward the window, where the wind now drove a branch to tap repeatedly against the pane like an impatient suitor. "Only, she asked to speak to her father privately, just before the ceremony." Wimsey's interest sharpened, though his tone remained light. "Indeed. And what did Lord Ferris say about that?" "Nothing. He refuses to discuss it." I assumed it was nerves, perhaps a last-minute anxiety about the marriage. "You understand, Anne was an independent girl, not given to sentimental attachments. I believe she married Mr. Carlyle because it was time she married someone respectable." Wimsey inclined his head. "Ah, the respectable Mr. Carlyle. How was the match arranged?" Lady Ferris's spine straightened. They met in London at a dinner party hosted by the Carmichaels. They corresponded for a time. She was never much for chaperoned visits, and he proposed in March. A very suitable match. But not, if you'll forgive the vulgarity, a love match? I do not see how that is relevant. Then let us say, I find everything relevant until it proves otherwise. Lady Ferris looked about to object when the butler reappeared with tea. The service was, as expected, immaculate. Wimsey took his cup with a murmur of appreciation and asked, seemingly off-handedly, "Do you know if your daughter ever had an interest in music?" "Music?" The question clearly threw her. She played the piano passably. I wouldn't say she had passion for it. No particular fondness for lullabies? Folk songs? Anything haunting in a minor key? She frowned. "Not that I recall." "What an odd question." "Oh, quite. I make it a point to ask at least one absurd question per visit. A hobby of mine." He turned to Parker. "Charles, we must speak with the father." They found Lord Ferris in his study, surrounded by the faded glories of fox-hunting prints and the kind of books that no one ever actually reads. He was a barrel-chested man, whose natural inclination toward bluster had been severely curtailed by the past 3 days of scandal. He waved a half-smoked pipe in their direction as they entered. "If this is about Anne," he began heavily, "I've already told the inspector. Damned nonsense, the lot of it. No girl disappears into thin air. She must have had help. Eloped, probably. Though with whom?" He broke off and shook his head. "I thought Carlyle was safe. Not exciting, God knows, but safe." "Safe men," said Wimsey, "are often the least prepared for vanishing brides. May I ask what your daughter said to you before the ceremony?" Lord Ferris glanced toward the door, then back. "Confidential, what she said." I shall treat it with the sanctity of a confession, though with rather more interest." The older man grunted. She asked if I trusted Carlyle. Strange question, I thought. Said it suddenly, without preamble. I said of course I did. What was there not to trust? Good family, decent fortune, bit bookish. Not much of a chin, but then, who is these days? But she didn't seem reassured, just nodded and said, "That's enough then." Did she seem frightened? No, not frightened. Tense, focused, as though she were trying to make a decision and had almost made it. Whimsy nodded slowly. "Did she ask you anything else?" Lord Ferrers hesitated. She asked whether the south wing still had the old bell rope in the passage, the one near the servants' stairs. Parker's eyebrows lifted. Odd thing to ask. I told her it had been disconnected years ago. That wing hasn't been used since my mother's time. Just old storage and a few guest rooms no one likes. Whimsy stood, and yet she asked about it. Curious. "Tell me, Lord Ferrers, did your daughter have any connection to the March girl?" "Eloise?" "Childhood friends. Grew apart after school. Eloise was abroad for years." "Why?" "Because I think Miss March may have a part to play. Charles, shall we?" They found Miss March in the conservatory, surrounded by wilting ferns and a canary that looked as if it had given up on joy. She was not conventionally pretty, but her features were lively, particularly her eyes, which darted toward Whimsy and then quickly away. She stood as they entered, brushing imaginary dust from her skirt. "Are you here to ask about Anne?" she said at once. "That is the general theme," said Whimsy. "Miss March, forgive the directness, but I should like you to describe her mood on the day of the wedding." "She was resigned," Eloise said slowly. "She smiled when she had to, but there was something brittle underneath. I know Anne, she never liked to be cornered. She used to climb trees as a child just to get away from people." "Do you believe she left of her own accord?" Eloise looked up sharply. "You do, don't you?" "I believe she left. That much seems obvious. But what I wish to understand is why. She told me something, the morning of the wedding." Her voice dropped. "She said she'd remembered something that had changed her mind. But she wouldn't say what, only that she had to act quickly or it would be too late." "Too late for what?" "She didn't explain. She just gave me a hug and said, 'If I'm not there this evening, don't let them lie about it. Find out the truth.'" Whimsy was very still. "And what did you think she meant?" Eloise hesitated, then said quietly, "I think she discovered something about Reginald Carlyle." They left her soon after, with promises of confidentiality and thanks, and walked back through the long corridor toward the bridal suite once more. Parker broke the silence. "You think she planned her own disappearance?" "I think she anticipated the need for escape," said Whimsy, "and I think the dressing room door that always sticks was precisely her exit. It leads to the corridor, not far from the servants' stairs, and if she knew which guests were awake and which were not, she could have slipped away unnoticed. But what she meant to do after, and what she feared Carlyle would do, remains to be seen." "Still no clue where she went?" "No, but we're beginning to understand how. Now we must uncover why." He paused, looking back at the long shadowed corridor. "And I suspect that somewhere in this house, someone knows." Behind them, the wind picked up again, and somewhere, perhaps in the forgotten south wing, a door creaked faintly, as if to say it had heard them coming. Whimsy paused outside the threshold of the south wing, where the air took on the faint smell of mildew and aged wood. The corridor before them was narrow, dimly lit, and lined with faded oil portraits whose subjects seemed to watch the investigators with unflattering suspicion. A tattered runner muffled their footsteps, and Parker noted the cobwebs spun thick in corners. Clearly, this portion of the house had not felt the tread of guests or servants for quite some time. Whimsy tapped the nearest door with his cane. It groaned open to reveal a disused sitting room, half draped in dust sheets. A moth fluttered indignantly toward the ceiling. "Here we have it," he murmured, stepping inside and turning in a slow circle. The theater of escape. Parker, following, glanced toward the shuttered windows. "You think she hid here before making her way out?" "Not necessarily here," Whimsy said, lifting the dust cloth from a low sideboard and inspecting the faint trail of disturbed dust. "But somewhere close. The bridal suite lies almost directly opposite across the servants' stairwell. If Miss Ferris entered the passage from her dressing room, and we have reason to believe she did, this wing offered concealment and, perhaps, an alternative route outside." He turned toward the end of the corridor, where a tall door stood half ajar. "Cellars?" Parker guessed. "Possibly. Or a tradesman's exit. Let's see." The door opened with a reluctant creak onto a narrow stone stairwell, descending into darkness that smelled of damp chalk and long-forgotten coal. Whimsy produced a small torch from his coat pocket. Never go visiting without one. Country houses are nothing if not opportunities for ruinous litigation. And led the way downward. The steps opened into what had once been a servant's scullery, with rusted hooks along the walls and an old dumbwaiter shaft yawning open like a narrow throat. Parker tested the hinges of a side door, which yielded with a heavy scrape, letting in a gust of cold air and a view of the gravelled path behind the house. A disused delivery entrance, unguarded, unlit, and, most notably, unguarded on the day of the wedding. "No one thought to lock it," Parker observed. "They likely assumed no one used it," said Whimsy. "Precisely why it makes the perfect escape route. And still no one saw her go." "No one claimed to," Whimsy corrected, "but I begin to suspect that someone did," and chose silence. They returned upstairs, minds ticking. In the main hall, Whimsy stopped one of the younger footmen with a cordial wave. "Tell me, Jenkins, was anyone posted at the back of the house during the wedding?" The footman, clearly unused to addressing nobility directly, stammered, "Not really, my lord. There was no reason to. Everyone was focused on the main event. Most of the staff were in the kitchens or the front hall." "No deliveries scheduled? No groundskeeper about?" "Not to my knowledge, sir." Whimsy smiled thinly. "Thank you, Jenkins. You've been more helpful than you know." Once the lad had departed, Parker said quietly, "So she had an exit, unmonitored. She could have left unnoticed." "Yes, and I now believe she did. But the question remains, where did she go, and whom did she trust enough to aid her?" They returned to the drawing room, where a low fire had been lit against the gloom. Carlyle was waiting, slouched in an armchair, staring into the grate with a glass of sherry in his hand and an expression of brooding injury on his face. He stood as they entered, but without enthusiasm. "More questions, Lord Peter?" "Just a few. If you can bear it." Carlyle gestured stiffly. "I've nothing to hide, though I wish you'd focus on finding her, not inventing ways to imply I've frightened her off." Whimsy ignored the jab. "Tell me, did Anne ever speak of the South Wing?" Carlyle frowned. "Not that I recall. Why would she?" "She may have made her way through it on the day of the wedding." Carlyle stiffened. "You mean she was already planning to bolt?" "That possibility is under consideration. Did you quarrel with her that morning?" "No. We hardly spoke. She was being dressed when I arrived, and I... Wait, there was something." He hesitated. "When I came to check if everything was in order, before the guests arrived, I passed her room. I thought I heard something, raised voices." "Whose voice?" "Anne's. And, well, it sounded like Eloise March." Whimsy's eyes glinted. "Indeed. They stopped when I knocked," Carlyle added. "Eloise came out and told me Anne needed rest, that she'd see me at the altar. I thought it best not to press." "Most understanding of you," Whimsy said lightly, "given that your bride was confiding in someone else on the most important day of your life." Carlyle looked at him sharply. but said nothing. The room's silence lengthened, broken only by the clink of Parker stirring his tea. "Tell me," said Whimsy after a pause, "how well do you know Eloise March?" Carlyle blinked. "Not particularly well. She lived abroad until recently." "Why?" "Just idle curiosity. I find her an intriguing sort of person. Intelligent, intense, perhaps a little theatrical." "She's always struck me as overdramatic," said Carlyle shortly, "clinging to Anne like a sister, but always undermining her choices. She never liked me." "And why should she not?" murmured Whimsy. "A dependable, respectable man such as yourself." Carlyle didn't respond. Whimsy rose, brushing an invisible speck from his sleeve. "Well, Mr. Carlyle, you've been most obliging. Parker and I shall trouble you no further, today." Back in the corridor, Parker muttered, "He's on edge. I don't think he's lying, but I don't think he's telling the whole truth either." "No, and I think Miss March is also being economical with her memories. She helped Anne escape. It's a plausible hypothesis, but I'd like to see what she's hiding. If you were Anne Ferris, and you just walked away from your own wedding, where would you go first?" "To someone you trusted." "Precisely. Let's pay Miss March another visit, but not in the conservatory this time. I'd like to see her room." Eloise's quarters were on the upper floor, modest in size, but fastidiously arranged. A slim volume of Shelley lay open on the desk, and a travelling case rested half unpacked at the foot of the bed. There was no sign of her at first glance. "Eloise," Whimsy called gently. There was a faint sound, water perhaps. Then the bathroom door opened and she appeared, hair damp, a dressing robe knotted firmly around her waist. "You might have knocked." "I thought I had. Apologies." Whimsy's tone was perfectly urbane. "We were just hoping for a word." Eloise stepped into the room, eyes narrowed. "You've come to accuse me." "Not at all," Whimsy said smoothly. "We've simply uncovered an interesting fact, that you and Anne spoke on the morning of the wedding." Carlyle overheard it. Something in her face twitched. It was a private conversation. "Of course, and I have no desire to violate confidences. But I wonder, did you suggest that she leave?" Eloise hesitated. "I told her she didn't have to go through with it. That's all. That if she was in doubt, she should follow her instincts." "And did she tell you what she planned to do?" "No." Eloise looked away. "But I knew she wouldn't go through with it. She'd remembered something, some detail that had been bothering her." "What sort of detail?" "I don't know. She wouldn't say. Only that she'd heard something." Whimsy was very still. "Heard?" "Yes." Eloise looked back at him now, her face pale. "She said she'd heard a voice. Late one night, whispering outside her door. She thought it was a dream at first, but then it happened again, the same words, over and over." Whimsy's voice was a thread. "What words?" "She wouldn't say. Only that they were wrong, that they didn't make sense, that they made her afraid." "Afraid of Carlyle?" Eloise nodded slowly. "She said he'd told her a story once, about a poem he'd written as a child, about a girl who locked herself in a tower to escape her wedding, and how he'd always loved the image." Whimsy looked at her for a long moment, then said very softly, "Thank you, Miss March. That was remarkably helpful." As they left, Parker exhaled. "Well, that's a new angle. Whispering voices, childhood poems. This is becoming rather gothic." "Yes," said Whimsy, not smiling. "And if I'm right, someone is trying very hard to shape this into a tragedy. But what interests me more is when the voice spoke. And who it belonged to." They paused at the head of the stairs. Whimsy turned, eyes sharp. "Tell me, Charles, do you recall the layout of the guest rooms?" Parker blinked. "Roughly. Why?" "Because I'd very much like to know who was sleeping in the room next to Anne's." and somewhere below, the clock struck 3, its chime echoing strangely against the high walls, as if, in some forgotten corner of the house, someone had been listening all along. Parker furrowed his brow as they descended the staircase, already reaching for the mental diagram he had of the guest quarters. "If I recall correctly," he said, "Anne's suite was on the east corridor. The rooms beside hers were left vacant, one because of a plumbing fault, and the other reserved for distant cousins who never arrived. But just beyond, 2 doors down, was the room given to Reverend Nash." Whimsy's brows lifted, but he said nothing until they reached the landing. A man of God with a penchant for whispers? That would be an unfortunate twist in the narrative. "Not necessarily him," said Parker. "But if Anne heard whispering more than once, someone knew she was there, and someone wanted her unsettled." Whimsy nodded absently. "Yes, and the most efficient way to unsettle someone is to insinuate, not announce, danger." A voice in the night, a childhood tale echoed without context, all just vague enough to keep her off balance. "And Carlyle. I suspect he knows more than he dares admit. Perhaps not where she's gone, but why. He strikes me as a man well practiced in emotional omission." They turned down the corridor, footsteps muted on the thick runner, until they reached the Reverend's door. Whimsy knocked briskly. There was the scrape of a chair, the shuffle of slippers, and finally the door opened to reveal Reverend Nash in shirt sleeves, spectacles perched on his forehead, and a well-thumbed copy of The Cloud of Unknowing in one hand. "Ah," he said with a wan smile. "Gentlemen, still at it?" "Still seeking clarity, Reverend," said Whimsy amiably. "Might we trouble you for a word?" The Reverend stepped back, allowing them in. The room was modestly appointed, neither neglected nor particularly lived in, and carried the faint smell of lavender and old sermon paper. "We won't keep you long," said Parker. "Just a few questions about the night before the wedding. Did you hear anything unusual? Voices? Footsteps?" Nash's brow furrowed. "I was deep in preparation for the service. I retired early. I may have heard something once. A soft voice. I thought it part of a dream. A woman's voice, perhaps. Very low. Any words?" "No. Only a tone. It was sorrowful. Melancholy, even. If I were more poetic, I'd say it sounded like mourning." "Mourning," repeated Whimsy. "Not fright? No. More like someone grieving a thing not yet lost." Whimsy was silent for a moment. "Tell me, Reverend, did Miss Ferris strike you as content in her engagement?" Nash folded his arms. "She struck me as dutiful, but that is not the same thing." "No," said Whimsy softly. "It's rather its opposite." Back in the corridor, Parker exhaled. So the voice was real, but if it wasn't Nash, and if the neighboring rooms were empty, then it came from the walls or the floors. Whimsy finished. "An old house like this is full of whispers, pipes, panels, forgotten servants' roots. But I don't think Anne was imagining things. I think someone used that voice to remind her of something or warn her, and I think we're close." He stopped at a narrow cupboard door halfway down the hall. It was painted the same dull cream as the walls and nearly invisible in the gloom. "This, I believe, is a linen closet," he said, opening it to reveal dusty shelves and a narrow space barely wider than a man's shoulders. But behind the shelves was a gap, just enough to squeeze through, and beyond that, the telltale blackness of a narrow passage. "Well," said Whimsy cheerfully, "after you, Charles." The passage led downward by cramped wooden steps, air growing colder as they descended. They passed between walls, plaster on one side, lath on the other, and emerged finally in the hollow behind a paneled corridor near Anne's dressing room. Whimsy pushed gently at a hidden door, which gave way with a reluctant sigh. They stood once more in the corridor outside the bridal suite. "She could have stood here," said Parker, and whispered through the panel into her own room. Whimsy nodded. "Or someone else could have." There was movement behind them, a rustle. Both men turned sharply. At the far end of the corridor, Eloise March stood, framed by the heavy curtains, her hands clenched at her sides. "You found it," she said. Not a question. "We did," said Whimsy, watching her carefully. "How long have you known about it?" "I found it when we were girls. We used to play hide and seek. Anne always found the best spots." "And you used it the night before the wedding?" Eloise's expression did not change, but her voice dropped. "Yes." "To say what?" "I told her not to marry him." Her voice shook now. "I told her that he'd lied, that he wasn't who he said he was." "What lie?" Eloise stepped forward, slowly, as though each step cost her. "He told Anne he was an only child, that his parents were dead, but I remember differently. Years ago I visited a friend in Devon. The name Carlyle came up. Reginald Carlyle was not an only child. He had a sister who died. Horribly. A fire. They said the family kept her locked away, that she was unwell. Dangerous." Parker's eyes narrowed. "Why hide that?" "Because Anne asked him once, casually, and he denied it, said he'd never had a sister. I only remembered the name a few days before the wedding. I told Anne. She went very still, and then she said, 'That's it. That's what I couldn't remember.' She hadn't recognized the name. Not consciously, but she said she'd heard it whispered. The night before she went to bed, and again the next morning, just before waking. Not a voice she recognized, just a name. Violet Carlyle." Whimsy's face had gone pale. "The ghost in the tower, the poem, the whispers. It wasn't imagination. It was memory, surfacing. Something she'd read or heard long ago. She asked me to help her," Eloise went on. "To help her get out without anyone stopping her. We planned it that morning while her mother thought she was resting. She used the South Wing passage. I waited outside with my car. I drove her to the station." "And then?" asked Parker quietly. "She took a train to London, said she had somewhere to go, someone to find. A man named Morgan. I don't know more than that." Whimsy nodded. "You've done your part, Miss March, and I believe you've saved her from something very grim." Eloise exhaled, all the defiance draining from her shoulders. Later, as they stood on the stone steps outside, the wind tugging at their coats, Parker said, "So she's alive. That's something." "Yes," said Whimsy. "Alive and perhaps on the trail of a secret her fiancé would have buried. Do we follow her? We must. The name Morgan is our lead now. But first, we must confront Mr. Carlyle. Not with accusation, just with truth. Let's see how he responds." Inside, the house waited, silent and full of listening walls. They found Carlyle alone in the billiards room, chalking the end of a cue with methodical precision. He looked up at their entrance, but did not pause, merely gestured toward the triangle of balls as if inviting them to join a game. Whimsy declined with a flick of his hand. "Not today. I've had enough angles and collisions for one afternoon." Carlyle returned the cue to the rack with a quiet click and turned, arms folded. "I assume you're not here for pleasantries." "Assumptions have their dangers," said Whimsy, approaching slowly. "But in this case, you're correct. We've spoken again with Miss March." Carlyle's expression didn't change, but a line appeared between his brows. "She was reluctant," Whimsy went on, "but helpful. She told us about the voice. The whispers Anne heard at night. You know the ones I mean." Carlyle let the silence grow before answering. Anne had a vivid imagination. She was easily influenced. "She was influenced, certainly," said Whimsy, "by facts, like the existence of a sister you told her you never had." There was a small, imperceptible shift in Carlyle's stance, enough for Whimsy to notice, not enough for a jury. "Violet Carlyle," Whimsy said gently. "Your sister, dead in a fire, years ago, hidden away because she was ill, perhaps dangerous. Anne found out, didn't she? Carlyle stepped toward the hearth and braced a hand against the mantel. That has nothing to do with this. Oh, but I think it has everything to do with this, said Wimsey. A man doesn't erase a sibling from his history without reason. Anne was fond of truth. Eloise said she always reacted strongly to lies. Carlyle's hand clenched. She wasn't erased, he said. She was tragic. My parents never recovered. It wasn't something we talked about. I didn't want Anne to see the past through that lens. It had no bearing on us. And yet when she learned the truth, however it came to her, she chose to walk away from you. She panicked, Carlyle said, turning abruptly. She let doubt overtake reason. Eloise always filled her head with suspicion. She poisoned her against me. She didn't need poisoning, said Wimsey. Anne was already listening to her instincts, and her instincts told her that the man she was marrying had secrets he couldn't even admit to himself. Carlyle's face twitched with a brief, involuntary snarl. You speak as if she were some oracle. She was frightened, that's all, spooked by old stories and shadows. No, said Wimsey, more gently now. She was frightened by the silence, by what she wasn't told. A whisper in the dark isn't frightening on its own, but when it feels familiar, when it strikes a chord buried deep in the mind, it becomes something else, something urgent. He took a step forward, lowering his voice. Did you whisper it, Reginald? Did you try to remind her of something she couldn't place? Violet's name, perhaps? Her voice? Carlyle's face drained of color. You think I... No, I never... He swallowed. I don't sleep near her suite. You know that. Someone used that passage. Someone with motive, but not, perhaps, to frighten her away. To test her. Carlyle looked up sharply. Wimsey went on. You said you knew Anne had doubts, but you thought they would pass. You believed she'd marry you in the end. You saw her as idealistic, but also dutiful. You thought if you let the past surface just enough, just the edges, it would shake her, but not drive her off. And if she stayed, it would prove her loyalty. That's absurd. It's cruel, Wimsey corrected, which is not the same thing. For a moment, Carlyle didn't answer. His eyes dropped to the floor. Then he said, low and bitter, I loved her. I believe you did, said Wimsey. In your way. But love is not ownership, Mr. Carlyle, and it is not silence. Parker, who had remained in the doorway until now, said quietly, Did she know about the fire? Carlyle's shoulders sank. Only what Eloise told her, and I suppose what she guessed. He turned toward the fire again. Violet died when I was 12. She'd wandered into the east wing. There was a stove in an unused room. No one saw her go. My father found her. He stopped, struggling. Wimsey let the pause stretch, the silence respectful, heavy. I didn't lie to Anne, Carlyle said at last. I omitted. I didn't want to be seen through that. Through a tragedy I had no control over. But it wasn't the tragedy that drove her away, said Wimsey. It was the concealment, the fact that you gave her a version of yourself instead of the whole. The fire cracked, and Carlyle's mouth pressed into a hard line. Wimsey nodded, satisfied. One final thing. She's gone to London. She's looking for someone named Morgan. Do you know who that is? Carlyle looked up, surprised. Morgan? No. Then he paused. Wait. She mentioned a solicitor once, when we were reviewing the marriage agreement. An old family contact. Morgan. Hatfield and Morgan, I think. Her father's firm used them. She may have gone there. Wimsey exchanged a look with Parker. Good. Then we may still reach her. They left Carlyle alone with his fire and his silence. By the time they reached the drive, the late afternoon had turned to a bruised dusk, the air heavy with impending rain. Parker pulled the collar of his coat tighter. London next. Yes, said Whimsy, staring off toward the line of trees at the far edge of the property. She's seeking refuge, or perhaps just a clean line between her past and her next move. But I suspect she'll leave a trail. They arranged transport into town and secured 2 tickets on the evening express. Whimsy wrote 2 brief telegrams en route, one to his man Bunter, requesting research into Hatfield and Morgan's client history, and another to an inspector friend at Scotland Yard, requesting a discreet trace on any bookings made under Anne Ferris's name in the last 48 hours. As the train gathered speed through the countryside, Whimsy sat with his gloved fingers steepled, staring at nothing. Parker, across from him, finally asked, "Do you think she'll want to be found?" "I don't know," Whimsy said, "but I think she wants answers, and that may bring her to us before we reach her." The city's lights rose up through the fog like submerged stars. When they arrived at King's Cross just after 9, the night had settled thick and sullen around the streets. Whimsy hailed a cab and directed it toward Chancery Lane. "Hatfield and Morgan has a clerk who works late," he said. "If we're lucky, he's still there." They arrived at the firm's building, a prim Georgian facade behind wrought iron fencing. A single light glowed on the upper floor. Whimsy pressed the bell with the easy confidence of a man who knew doors opened more often when one appeared entitled to the entry. After a moment, the door creaked open and a man in shirt-sleeves and spectacles peered out. "Yes?" "Apologies," said Whimsy smoothly. "I'm Lord Peter Whimsy. This is Detective Inspector Parker. We're inquiring after Miss Anne Ferris." The clerk hesitated, visibly torn. "She's not in trouble," Whimsy added. "We're trying to ensure her safety. She may have contacted your firm." The clerk's shoulders eased a little. "She came this morning, asked to speak to Mr. Hatfield. Said she had something urgent to deposit for safekeeping." "What sort of thing?" "She wouldn't say. Only that it was evidence. Something personal. She said she might be followed." Whimsy's expression sharpened. "Followed?" The clerk nodded. She was calm but firm. "Said we were to release the document only in the event she failed to return within 3 days. And if she does return?" "Then no harm done," she said, but she insisted on the condition. Whimsy exhaled slowly. "Did she leave a contact address?" "Only a hotel," said the clerk, turning to retrieve a small card from the front desk ledger. "She checked in under her own name, the Henley Court Hotel, St. James's." Whimsy took the card and nodded once. "Thank you. You've been most helpful." As they stepped back into the cold, the fog had thickened, muffling the noise of the street. Parker said, "You think she's in danger?" "I think she believes she is," Whimsy said, "and that's enough." They hailed another cab, bound for St. James's, both men silent now, and somewhere between the thinning mist and the rising lights, a window blinked shut 3 stories above, a pale shape disappearing behind glass, as though someone, watching, had just decided the time for secrecy was over. The cab rolled slowly through the mist-thickened lanes of St. James's, the driver squinting through the windscreen while the street lamps blurred like pale moons along the roadside. Inside the cab, Whimsy sat motionless, one gloved hand tapping absently on the window ledge. Parker, opposite, had long since closed his notebook and was now watching Whimsy with quiet expectation. "She's nervous," Whimsy said at last. "Not frightened exactly, but alert. She's done something she believes is necessary, something she knows could make her a target." "You think she has evidence against Carlyle?" "I think she thinks she does. That distinction may prove fatal if we're not quick." They reached the Henley Court Hotel, a handsome but understated building tucked between 2 private clubs, its brass nameplate dimmed by years of London soot. The doorman offered no resistance when Whimsy showed his card, and within minutes they were ushered into a drawing room heavy with velvet drapes and polished mahogany. The manager, a trim man in a pinstriped waistcoat, met them with a professional smile. "Yes, Miss Ferris is a guest here," he confirmed, glancing at his ledger. "Checked in yesterday afternoon. Room 312. Have you seen her today? She came down to breakfast but left shortly after. Said she might be back late. Did she appear unsettled, in distress?" The man hesitated. "Not distressed, no, but watchful. She requested that no callers be admitted without explicit instruction." Parker gave a grim nod. "And yet she told the solicitor she might be followed." The manager straightened. "Is she in danger, gentlemen?" "That's what we're trying to prevent," Whimsy said. "May we see the room?" "I believe she left the key," the manager said, moving briskly behind the desk. "Yes, here it is." They rode the lift to the third floor in silence. Outside room 312, Whimsy paused with his hand on the key. There was no sound from within, no movement. He inserted the key gently and turned it. The room was tidy, almost untouched. A coat hung on the wardrobe hook. A small valise stood neatly at the foot of the bed. On the desk, a railway timetable, a notepad with 2 lines torn away, and a cheap fountain pen. The curtains were half drawn, the air faintly scented with lavender soap. Whimsy crossed to the bed and touched the pillow. "Cool. She hasn't returned," he murmured. Parker moved to the desk. "Here, look at this." He held up a receipt, folded and tucked between the pages of the railway guide. 1 ticket, Liverpool Street to Colchester. Dated this morning. "Colchester?" Whimsy frowned. "That's out of the pattern. Family connections?" "None that we've heard." Whimsy pulled the torn sheet from the wastebasket and smoothed it. It bore a faint imprint of writing, the ghost of 2 lines. "M has agreed. Meet at usual place. 4:15. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 5:03. He looked up. "We're behind her, but not far. There's something in Colchester, someone she trusts. Or perhaps—" He trailed off. "Perhaps someone she doesn't trust at all," Parker finished grimly. They left the room undisturbed, save for the receipt and the notepaper, which Parker carefully pocketed. Back downstairs, Whimsy asked for access to the telephone and rang the Hatfield and Morgan office. A junior clerk answered, breathless. "She hasn't returned," the boy confirmed, "but Mr. Hatfield did examine the item she left. He said it was a letter, very old, signed by someone named Violet. He wouldn't tell me more." "That's enough," said Whimsy. "We're tracing her now." Back in the cab, Whimsy paced the implications aloud. She learned the truth about Violet, found the name linked to something more, and instead of going to the police, she went to a solicitor. Not for protection, but for insurance. She's maneuvering, she's afraid of someone, yes, but she's also trying to corner them. Carlyle, or someone connected to his past. Someone who remembers the truth about Violet, and who knows that Anne knows it too. Parker glanced sideways. Then who would she meet in Colchester? Whimsy's eyes narrowed. Not who, where. Think of the note. Meet at the usual place. That implies routine, repetition. Somewhere they've met before. Somewhere private. The train to Colchester was half empty, and the hour-long journey passed in near silence. Whimsy remained standing by the window most of the way, eyes fixed on the blackening countryside rushing past. As they approached the station, he turned to Parker. "We'll try the old registry offices first," he said. "Anything that might house deeds, letters. Violet's name may still be on record." Colchester was wet and shuttered when they arrived, the streets glazed with recent rain. A single gas lamp outside the station flickered uncertainly in the wind. They hired a car and driver to take them into town. Their first stop was the local records office. Inside, an elderly clerk recognized the name Violet Carlyle almost at once. "There was a Miss Carlyle," he confirmed, eyes scanning a brittle volume. "Died in 1910. Fire at the Hawthorne Sanatorium. Some scandal at the time. There was talk of neglect. Lawsuit filed by the family. It was settled quietly. Any living staff from that sanatorium? He shook his head. Closed down years ago. Torn down, I believe. But I do recall there was a nurse, a Miss Amelia Morgan, who testified during the inquiry. She left afterward. Local whispers said she'd seen something that wasn't meant to be seen. Whimsy's eyes sharpened. Morgan. Parker nodded slowly. Could be her, if she's still alive. The clerk retrieved a second volume. Census returns, and within minutes they had an address. A small cottage on the edge of town. Still occupied by an A. Morgan. They left at once. The cottage sat on a quiet lane beneath a stand of chestnut trees, the roof slick with recent rain, windows glowing dimly behind sheer curtains. The garden was modest but tidy. Whimsy rapped once, then again. At last the door opened, and there stood Anne. She was pale, her eyes shadowed with fatigue, but her voice was steady. "I thought you might come." Whimsy gave a small bow. "You're not easy to follow, Miss Ferris." Anne stepped back. "Come in. You'll want to meet her." Inside, the room was warm and lined with books. A small fire crackled in the hearth. At the far end of the sitting room, a tall, spare woman with hair pulled into a tight knot rose from an armchair. "You must be Lord Whimsy," she said. "I'm Amelia Morgan." Whimsy extended a hand. "Miss Morgan, we've come regarding Violet Carlyle." The woman gave a faint smile. "Then you'd best sit down, because what I have to say isn't easily told." Anne moved to the hearth and folded her arms. "She didn't die in the fire," she said. "Not at first." Morgan nodded. "That's true. Violet survived for 3 days, and in those 3 days, she told me things. Things about her brother, about the family, things that terrified her." Whimsy didn't move. "Go on." Morgan's voice was low but steady. "She claimed her brother had tried to frighten her, that he wanted her committed. There were incidents, small, strange things, meant to make her appear mad. She believed it was part of a plan to secure her portion of a family trust." Parker inhaled sharply. "You're saying Carlyle was a boy at the time?" Morgan interrupted. "Yes, but a boy who understood manipulation, who knew how to appear innocent." Whimsy looked at Anne. "And you believe this?" Anne met his gaze. "I believe she wrote it down. I have the letter." Morgan opened a drawer and withdrew a small envelope, its paper yellowed with time. She handed it to Whimsy. He opened it slowly. Inside, the handwriting was elegant, slanted, frantic in places. The letter spoke of isolation, of voices at night, of gaslights turned off without cause. It named Reginald, described events identical to those Anne had recently experienced. It ended with one line: "If anything happens to me, let them know it was not madness, let them know it was fear." Whimsy folded the letter carefully and looked up. "This," he said, "changes everything." Whimsy held the letter for a long moment, eyes scanning it again, as though some detail might emerge more clearly the second time. The flicker of the fire played across his features, lending them a fleeting, troubled depth. "This," he said again, more quietly now, "was meant to be buried." Anne sat back slightly, arms folded across her chest as if steadying herself against what she had already accepted. "I found it by accident. Eloise gave me a bundle of old things she thought I should look through before the wedding. Said they were keepsakes, nothing more. Most of it was harmless, but that letter was folded between the pages of a French devotional. There was no reason for it to be there unless Violet had meant it to be found." "Or hidden," Parker murmured. He leaned forward. "You say it was written in the sanatorium. Did you recognize the handwriting?" "Yes," Anne said at once. "It matches a note Reginald once showed me. An old birthday card from his mother, signed by Violet. The style is unusual. Slanted right, almost toppling, and the way she loops her F's." She trailed off, then looked at Morgan. You remember her. You know this is real. The older woman nodded solemnly. She was not mad, no matter what they said. Anxious, yes. Unwell at times. But she knew what was happening to her. And she feared it because she was lucid enough to understand she might be ignored. Whimsy turned the envelope over in his fingers, then glanced at the name etched in fading ink. Miss A. Morgan, Hawthorne Sanatorium. A direct appeal, and one that had never been delivered. Or had it? He turned to the nurse. Why did you keep it? I couldn't risk submitting it to the inquest, she said simply. Her family's lawyers were aggressive. Her father, Sir Edmund Carlyle, made it clear that the family reputation was paramount. They paid well for silence, but I couldn't destroy the letter. So you did the next best thing, Whimsy said softly. You kept it out of circulation, hoping one day someone might ask. Morgan met his gaze evenly. Hoping one day someone might deserve to know. Parker broke the silence that followed. And what now? This isn't enough for a court. It's old. It's hearsay. No, Whimsy agreed, but it's leverage. He stood and began pacing slowly. We don't need a court. What we need is a confession, or a mistake, and Carlyle's already made one. He let Anne slip through his fingers. He underestimated her resolve. Anne's voice was dry. He assumed I'd come running back. I suppose he always thought I was just unsettled, that I'd doubt myself before I doubted him. But now, Whimsy said, stopping before the hearth, he's likely growing nervous. You've vanished. You've left a legal breadcrumb. And if I'm not mistaken, he'll start looking for you himself. He won't use the police. He'll use his own people. He has them, Parker asked. He has money, Whimsy replied. Money buys silence, and silence can be used to bury the truth. Anne straightened. Then we need to speak to Eloise again. She's known more than she ever said, and I think she's reached the end of her patience. I agree, Whimsy said. But I'd prefer not to leave you here alone. I'm not afraid. No? He said, giving her a faint smile. But you are a target. And Reginald Carlyle is not a man who takes exposure lightly. Morgan rose. She can stay here tonight. I have a back door and I'm used to long silences. If someone does come, I'll know it before they knock. Whimsy considered her a moment, then nodded. Very well. Anne, if anything changes, anything at all, you'll send word to me at once. She nodded, and something in her gaze, calm, unshaken, settled the matter. She had been frightened once, but not any more. By the time they were back in the car, the clouds had begun to break. The road shimmered with rain, and the moonlight returned, pale and cool, revealing the empty fields rolling out to either side. Parker glanced at Whimsy. Do you think he'll come after her himself? Whimsy shook his head. No, he'll send someone, likely a servant, maybe one of the estate staff, but not the valet. He's too visible. Then who? That, said Whimsy. We'll soon discover. They returned to London by the late train and were at Eloise March's flat by 10. She opened the door with the same distracted air, cigarette already in hand, the ashtray on her hallway table half full. You've found her, she said, not quite a question. Yes. She's all right. She is, and she's told us more. Eloise stepped aside to let them in. Then come in. I've been waiting for this. Inside, she poured drinks without being asked and passed them across. I've kept things from you, she said as she lit another cigarette. Not because I doubted Anne, but because I doubted myself. I told you I didn't hear the whispers. That wasn't quite true. I did hear something, just once. Whimsy's brow lifted. When? 2 nights before Anne left. I'd gone to check on her after dinner. She'd had a headache, and I brought some salts. I was in the corridor passing her room when I heard, not speech exactly, more like a humming, a low repetition, like someone reciting under their breath. I waited, listened. Then it stopped. When I entered, Anne was sitting up in bed, eyes wide, fists clenched. She didn't look at me. She just whispered. It's her voice. Violet, Parker said. She never named her, Eloise replied. But I knew. After that, she packed her bag. She didn't even argue with Carlyle. Just walked out. She left a note for me and for you. She rose, opened a drawer, and handed Whimsy a folded sheet of paper. He opened it carefully. Anne's handwriting, clipped and precise. If anything happens, Reginald will have known before anyone. Tell Lord Whimsy, Violet's ghost isn't a ghost. She's still in that house, one way or another. Whimsy stared at the note, then looked up slowly. She meant something more literal than we realized. Eloise met his gaze. There's an attic in the West Wing, sealed since before the war. Carlyle says it's unsafe, but I've always suspected it was just convenient. Whimsy rose at once. Then we're going back. You'll need a key, Eloise said. Do you have one? She stubbed out her cigarette. I have all of them. The return to the estate was unannounced. Whimsy and Parker arrived at dawn, the sky a dusty grey and the air heavy with dew. The household had not yet stirred. They moved quietly through the hall and up the west staircase, Eloise's key in hand. The attic door loomed at the end of a narrow hall, painted over but not locked. Whimsy inserted the key and turned it with a sharp click. Inside was dust, darkness, and a sharp scent of decay. But more than that, there was movement, a scuttling retreat into the shadows. They advanced carefully. Parker raised his torch. In the far corner, behind a battered armoire and under layers of canvas, was a small bed, and on the bed, fresh linens, a plate with food. Chair beside it, and a book of poems by Emily Brontë. Parker exhaled. Someone's been living here. Whimsy crossed to the bed. On the floor beside it was a pair of shoes, delicate, worn, women's, and in the dust near the door, footprints, several, going in, coming out. He turned to Parker. She didn't die in the fire, he said slowly. Or if she did, someone else lived in her name long after. Parker looked toward the window, where pale morning light crept through a broken pane. So who was buried in Violet's place? Whimsy didn't answer. He was already turning toward the staircase. Whimsy descended the attic steps in silence, each footfall measured as if too much haste might shatter some fragile, encroaching truth. Behind him, Parker followed, torch lowered now, and no longer shining ahead but angled to the floor, as though the real horror might lie not in what was found, but in the dusty footprints that led to it. They reached the landing of the west corridor, that narrow, disused passage with its faded wall sconces and the faint scent of dried rose petals long since crumbled to dust. Whimsy paused there and turned, his expression unreadable. She's been kept, he said at last. Hidden, tended to, like some shameful heirloom, not mad, not dead. Hidden. Parker's voice was low. But who? Who would keep her there all these years? The servants, the family? No servant acts without instruction in a house like this, Whimsy replied. They are discreet by profession, but not creative. They obey, they cover, but they do not originate. You think Carlyle did it himself? Reginald? No, or not alone. But someone has been complicit. Someone who knew where she was and saw fit to preserve the illusion of her absence. Perhaps even to protect her, or perhaps to silence her. Parker rubbed at his jaw. But why? If she was dangerous, if she were truly unwell. Then a sanatorium would have been simpler, safer, but this is theater. This is containment. They had reached the bottom of the stairs now, and Whimsy turned towards the rear corridor, where a narrow staircase led down to the old service wing. Come, there's someone I wish to see? Mrs. Teverton. Whimsy gave a small smile. Indeed, a housekeeper always knows what the walls cannot confess. They found her in the morning room, a stark chamber used now for administrative tasks, the sort of room where unwanted correspondence was filed and forgotten. She looked up from a worn accounts ledger, eyes shrewd, hands still. "Lord Wimsey," she said, neither surprised nor particularly pleased. "I take it you've been wandering where you oughtn't." "Merely making acquaintance with the house," he said genially, "in all its dusty corners. We found a room, an attic, rather well appointed for a space supposedly abandoned. It seems someone's been living there." She met his gaze squarely. "That room is sealed. Dangerous timbers. The family has been advised." "Then I must respectfully disagree with your surveyor," Wimsey said smoothly. "The timbers held perfectly well, but what was most interesting, Mrs. Teverton, wasn't the structure. It was the evidence of occupancy. Bedding, food, poetry." The housekeeper hesitated, then rose slowly, smoothing her skirt. Her face, long and angular, bore the expression of one who has carried secrets not lightly, but with a burdened precision. "You shouldn't have gone in," she said, voice quiet now. "You don't understand what you've disturbed." "Then help me understand," Wimsey said. She sighed. "I've kept this house for 27 years. I came as undermaid under Lady Violet's mother. I've seen 3 deaths, 5 births, and 1,000 lies beneath this roof, but none like hers. Violet was gentle, not soft. There's a difference. She saw too much, asked questions that made the men uncomfortable. And Reginald?" She gave him a sideways look. "He married her for position. She married him for hope. Neither bargain turned out as planned." "She wrote to Miss Morgan from the sanatorium," Wimsey said, producing the folded letter from his coat. "Do you know what happened after that?" "She never came back from the fire," Teverton said flatly. "No?" Wimsey arched a brow. "Then whose shoes are upstairs? Whose bed has fresh linen? Who reads Bronte and eats eggs poached with a pinch of salt and nutmeg?" That last detail was a guess, but the flicker across Teverton's face confirmed it. "She wasn't mad," the housekeeper said after a pause. "She knew too much. She knew about the money, the inheritance that was meant to pass to her son, not to Reginald. She suspected the books had been tampered with. Her father's will, there was a clause no one talked about, a clause about trust and guardianship. If she were declared unfit, the money passed to Carlyle directly. And if she died? The same." Parker made a low sound. "So she was locked away, not for her own good, but for someone else's fortune." "No doctor ever signed her committal," Teverton said. "It was all arranged privately, through influence, through threats. They gave her a name that wasn't hers, and they sent her away. But she came back." "Not until years later," the housekeeper said. "By then, Reginald had everything he wanted, and she was no longer a danger to him. She hardly spoke, but he didn't dare let her be seen, not with Anne arriving, not with the estate so precariously bound up in pretense." Wimsey was silent a long moment. Then he asked, "And who brought her food? Who washed her things?" Teverton looked away. "I did. Before me, Mrs. Hallam, the nurse. We thought it was a kindness." "No," Wimsey said. "It was not kindness. It was obedience, and it must end." She did not flinch. "Then what now, Lord Wimsey?" "Now we bring her out," he said, "and we bring the rest to light." They found her shortly after in the same attic room. She did not startle. She did not speak. She sat by the window, fingers resting on the edge of the sill, eyes turned toward a stretch of orchard beyond the east gardens. She was thinner than the portraits. Hair mostly grey, face lined in that way peculiar to those who have not aged naturally, but behind curtains, without seasons. "Lady Violet?" Wimsey asked gently. She turned at the voice, and for a moment, just a flicker, her eyes focused with startling clarity. "You're not Reginald?" "No," he said. "I'm here on behalf of Anne." Her fingers twitched. Then slowly, She reached for the small book on the table beside her and held it out. The Bronte, a page marked with a ribbon. Parker took it and read aloud. I lingered round them under that benign sky, watched the moths fluttering among the heath and harebells, listened to the soft wind breathing through the grass. Whimsy met her gaze. You were never mad, were you? She gave no reply, but her eyes were answer enough. They led her out with care, down through the house she had once ruled, now unfamiliar. As they passed the drawing-room, Eloise emerged, startled, and then, seeing her, covered her mouth with a trembling hand. I knew, she whispered. I always knew. Deep down. Whimsy turned. Make up a room, a real one, and call a doctor, not for confinement, for care. Teverton nodded once. She'll want the east-facing windows. She always did. And Carlyle? Parker asked as they reached the foyer. Whimsy looked toward the stairs, where a portrait of the late Sir Edmund loomed, cold-eyed and permanent. We confront him, he said, but not yet. Not until we've finished reconstructing the ledger, the will, and the time of the fire. We have the woman. Next, we need the proof. Outside, the sky was fully bright now. Morning birds trilled in hedgerows, unaware that anything had changed. But inside, the house breathed differently. Something had shifted, a presence restored, a silence broken. Whimsy lit a cigarette and stood a moment in the sun, watching as Lady Violet was helped toward the garden. He said nothing, but in his mind, the chronology was nearly complete. All that remained now was to prove the switch. The fire, and the missing body in the grave, marked with another woman's name. It was mid-morning by the time Whimsy and Parker reconvened in the library, a room still uncomfortably scented with sun-warmed velvet and the faint ghost of cigar smoke. A fresh pot of coffee sat untouched on the tray, cooling beside a plate of uneaten toast. The house, though no longer silent, moved with a stiff, uncertain air, as if the walls themselves had paused in surprise. Parker, never one for literary flourishes, went straight to the point. So, the woman in the attic is Violet Carlyle. She survived the fire at St. Ludlow's, the woman buried in her name. Whimsy tapped a slim index finger against the spine of the family ledger that now lay open on the desk. A nurse, I believe, the original Miss Hallam. Reginald hired her after the disappearance, supposedly to care for his ailing mother, but Lady Agatha died 2 years before. Curiously enough, Miss Hallam vanishes from the record shortly after Violet was meant to have died. You think he substituted the bodies? Burned the sanatorium wing deliberately, made it appear Violet had perished, and buried Hallam in her place? Oh, not directly, Whimsy said, his eyes distant. Carlyle wouldn't strike the match himself. He'd ensure it was a tragic accident, a faulty lamp, an unattended stove. But yes, the body in the grave was someone else's. It must be. Then we'll have to exhume it. Whimsy's expression was unreadable. Yes, but not yet. First, we verify the identity on paper. It's harder to dispute the dead when they're already accounted for among the living. He reached for a slim folio, Anne's legal documentation regarding her trust fund. According to this, Anne's full inheritance activates on her 21st birthday, provided no legal contest is raised. But there's a clause. Here. He pointed to a page, Parker leaning in. If Lady Violet is deceased and mentally unsound at time of death, Reginald Carlyle was granted provisional trusteeship over the estate, pending the outcome of Anne's majority. That clause was inserted, it seems, just 2 months before Violet's supposed death. Convenient, Parker muttered. Precisely. And who oversaw the change? None other than Mr. Elphinstone, the family solicitor, long since deceased. A loyal man, no doubt, but the paperwork surrounding Violet's committal was never filed publicly. It exists in shadow. Suggestion, not proof. Parker frowned. So Carlyle forged or suppressed the committal papers, falsified the death certificate, buried another woman under Violet's name, and stashed the real Lady Carlyle in his own attic? In a house that large, tucked away in the old wing, who would look, especially if the servants were complicit, or instructed not to question? Parker picked up the Bronte volume from the desk. And what now? Now, said Whimsy, we let Reginald come to us. It was nearing 11 when Carlyle returned. His motor crunched up the gravel drive with less confidence than usual, a vague hesitation in its pace. He entered the house briskly, hat still on, and was met by Teverton with all the solemnity of a butler announcing an unwelcome guest. There's been an incident, she said. You're wanted in the library. Carlyle's face changed at once. Concern first, quickly masked by control. Has Anne? No, sir, not Anne. He was composed enough when he entered the room, though Whimsy noted the twitch of his right thumb against the inner seam of his coat. A gambler's tell. I gather, Carlyle said, removing his gloves with deliberate precision, that something has come to light? Whimsy gestured to the chair opposite. Lady Violet, to be precise. Carlyle froze. Not dramatically, not in the way of dime novels or bad theatre, but with a single, fractional pause in movement that betrayed more than words. Impossible, he said after a beat. My wife is dead. Then I must be very much mistaken, Whimsy said airily, for I spent a delightful half-hour in conversation with her this morning. A little quiet, naturally, after so many years of solitude, but recognizably alive. Carlyle's lips thinned. I don't know what game you're playing, Lord Whimsy. No game, merely truth. Though admittedly, truth wears an odd hat in this case, and speaks in Bronte quotations. Carlyle stood abruptly. If there is some hysterical vagrant in the attic, I suggest you call the police. Oh, we've done better, Parker said, stepping forward. We've traced the nurse, Eliza Hallam, registered under a false name after the fire at St. Ludlow's. No family, no inquiries. Died of smoke inhalation. But here's the wrinkle. The nurse had a scar on her hand, burn from childhood. The woman in your wife's grave does not. Carlyle's eyes flickered. You've exhumed her. No, said Whimsy. Not yet. We didn't need to. The undertaker kept sketches. He was an amateur artist, it seems. A sentimental sort. The figure he buried was stockier, different jawline, incorrect dental records. A silence stretched. Carlyle's mouth worked slightly before he spoke. What do you want? I want, Whimsy said gently, the full account. I want Anne protected. I want Violet restored to her name, her dignity, and her legal rights. You'll ruin her. No, Whimsy said. That was your work. I'm merely untangling the damage. Carlyle sat again, heavily. She was unstable, always prone to moods, fantasies. She thought everyone was lying to her. I tried to help her, but she started talking about poisons, conspiracies, how the servants were in league with the trustees. I had no choice. She found the will, didn't she? Whimsy said softly. Carlyle said nothing. She found the clause that made Anne sole heir, and that removed your power entirely. So you had her silenced, not killed. That would have been too direct, too easily challenged, but you had her declared mad and hidden. She signed the papers, Carlyle said tightly. She agreed to the sanatorium. Under what condition? What threat? We found her letters, and the journals. Carlyle's gaze snapped up. You read them? Enough. She was frightened, alone, but not mad. The fire gave you a way out, a way to end the charade, except she survived. She was supposed to be dead, he said suddenly. I paid. I arranged. I identified the body. It should have been over. But instead she returned, and you hid her again. Not out of love, out of fear. Carlyle didn't reply. Whimsy leaned back. Here's what will happen. You will write a full confession. You will sign over all holdings in trust to Anne immediately. Lady Violet will be placed in proper care, not confinement. And you, Sir Reginald, will prepare to stand trial, or, if you prefer, depart the country with all haste and vanish into some suitably dismal exile. But either way, your time here is finished." Carlyle looked at him for a long moment. Then, with the slow, bitter clarity of a man too clever to pretend further, he rose. "I'll write," he said. Later that evening, as dusk fell over the gardens and the house began its slow unwinding, Wimsey stood by the French doors, cigar in hand. Anne sat curled in a corner, reading her mother's poetry aloud to Eloise, who dabbed her eyes discreetly with a handkerchief she claimed was dusty. Parker approached. "He's gone. Took the motor and a suitcase. Teverton says he didn't even look back." Wimsey nodded. "Good. He won't return. Not once the papers go public." Lady Violet. "She'll need care, but she'll have her name again, her daughter, and then some measure of peace." Parker studied him a moment. "You knew from the start, didn't you?" "Not the full truth. Just a feeling. The door that wouldn't open. The maid who flinched when asked, and a woman who disappeared without leaving behind a single pair of shoes." He exhaled smoke into the dusk. "People hide the dead out of shame," he said, "but they hide the living out of fear." And with that, he turned from the window and joined the women in the lamplight, where the voice of a long-silenced woman now echoed, faint but steady, across the velvet hush of a drawing-room newly alive with memory. The days that followed passed with a curious kind of gentleness, as if the house itself had begun the slow work of healing. The locked rooms were aired, the curtains drawn back, and the dust unsettled by long-overdue footsteps. Anne Carlyle, no longer the reluctant heiress, but the quietly resolute young woman her mother had hoped she'd become, oversaw it all with a calm that belied the whirlwind of revelations. Lady Violet, under the supervision of a compassionate and discreet specialist from London, recommended, of course, by Wimsey, was relocated to a discreet cottage on the coast. There, the sea could speak to her in low, calming rhythms, far from the corridors that had echoed with silence and the slow corrosion of memory. Wimsey lingered at the house longer than propriety strictly required, though no one dared suggest it. He took long breakfasts, wandered the grounds with a speculative expression, and corrected the Latin inscription on the family sundial with a stick of chalk, muttering something about Ovid abused by horticultural vanity. Parker returned to London, but not before neatly packaging the legal threads like a tailor laying out a three-piece suit. Reginald's flight was formalized as exile rather than prosecution, thanks in part to Anne's quiet insistence that she wanted no public scandal to shadow her mother's name. It was on the final afternoon, as the golden light poured across the drawing-room like a benediction, that Anne found Wimsey standing at the hearth, gazing into the unlit grate as though it might answer some lingering question. "You're leaving," she said simply. "I am, alas. The trout in Hertfordshire demand attention, and my man Bunter grows suspicious when I spend more than a week without requiring formal wear. He begins to fear I've joined a socialist youth group." She smiled faintly. "You never explained, not properly, how you knew." Wimsey turned, hands in his pockets, voice light but not mocking. "Ah, but explanation is such a vulgar thing. It reduces tragedy to arithmetic. Still, since you ask." He gestured with a finger, as if sketching the story in the air. "Your mother vanished without a trace. No letters, no sightings, not even a pair of gloves left behind. Very tidy for a woman who, by all accounts, was prone to melancholy rather than method. Then there was the will, amended just before her death in Reginald's favor. Convenient, and her supposed madness. No documented diagnosis, no attending physician who could be named, only the suggestion that she was unstable. Gossip, not proof." He moved to the window, watching a pair of gardeners set a broken urn back on its plinth. And then there was the house itself. Too many doors that didn't open, Teverton's quiet evasion when I asked about the West Wing. And the library. The books were untouched, except the Brontes. Someone had been reading Jane Eyre repeatedly, and not as a literary indulgence, as a message. A caged woman in an attic. Rather on the nose, don't you think? Anne looked down, twisting her signet ring. You never doubted she was alive. I suspected. But it was the tone of the silence that told me your mother's absence wasn't grief-tinged. It was calculated, hidden. The house bore it like a bad marriage, something everyone agreed not to speak of. She looked up. You saved her. No, my dear. I opened a door. You did the rest. They stood quietly for a moment, the room hushed but not strained. Lord Wimsey, she said finally, may I ask one thing? He inclined his head. Why do you do this? You're not a policeman. There's no reward. Why come here? Why stay when it's all so ugly? He tilted his head, considering. Because ugliness, he said slowly, is what happens when truth is locked away too long. I don't hunt for guilt or gore or scandal. I hunt for the thing, hidden in plain sight, the thing that should never have been concealed. Truth is not always kind, but it is always owed. She nodded, visibly moved. And what now? Now, he smiled. You replant the garden, tear down the old nursery wallpaper, pay the cook better wages. Visit your mother often, and never again apologize for hearing the hinge of a door in your dreams. He paused in the doorway, hat in hand, coat folded neatly over one arm. Also, he added, take care with husbands. Marrying for security is like hiring a wolf to watch your sheep. It keeps burglars away, but you must live with the teeth. Anne laughed then, a real laugh, the first since the business began. I'll remember that. He gave a courtly bow and departed without further ceremony, his footsteps fading into the gravel. As the motor turned down the long, curved drive, Anne stood at the window until the last gleam of the car's roof vanished into the trees. Somewhere in the garden, a wind stirred the yews, and far off, the sound of the sea rolled in faintly like the breath of a world just beginning again. And upstairs, in a small cedar box newly returned to her care, Lady Violet placed a pressed violet flower between the final pages of her journal, closed it, and at last allowed herself to sleep.